Paperjack. If you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Derek Bach. Churches aren't havens of spiritual enlightenment. They enclose the spirit. The way Jilly explains it, organizing mystery tends to undermine its essence. I'm not so sure I agree, but then I don't really know enough about it. When it comes to things that can't be logically explained, I take a step back and leave them to Jilly or my brother Christy. They thrive on that kind of thing. If I had to describe myself as belonging to any church or mystical order, it'd be one devoted to secular humanism. My concerns are for real people in the here and now. The possible existence of God, fairies, or some metaphysical other world just doesn't fit into my world view. Except, you knew there'd be an except, didn't you? Or else why would I be writing this down? It's not like I don't have anything to say. I'm all for creative expression, but my medium's music. I'm not an artist like Jilly or a writer like Christy. But the kinds of things that have been happening to me can't really be expressed in a fiddle tune. Now, that's not entirely true. I can express them, but the medium is such I can't be assured that when I'm playing, listeners hear what I mean them to hear. That's how it works with instrumental music, and it's probably why the best of it is so enduring. The listener takes away whatever he or she wants from it. Say the composer was trying to tell us about the aftermath of some great battle. When we hear it, the music might speak to us of a parent we've lost, a friend's struggle with some debilitating disease, a doe standing at the edge of a forest at twilight, or any of 1,000 other unrelated things. Realistic art like Jilly does, or at least it's realistically rendered, her subject matter's right out of some urban update of those Andrew Lang color-coded fairy tale books that most of us read when we were kids. And the collections of urban legends and stories that my brother writes don't have that same leeway. What goes down on the canvas or on paper, no matter how skillfully drawn or written, doesn't allow for much in the way of an alternate interpretation. So that's why I'm writing this down, to lay it all out in black and white, where maybe I can understand it myself. For the past week, every afternoon after busking up by the Williamson Street Mall for the lunchtime crowds, I've packed up my fiddle case and headed across town to come here to St. Paul's Cathedral. Once I get here, I sit on the steps about halfway up, take out this notebook, and try to write. The trouble is I haven't been able to figure out where to start. I like it out here on the steps. I've played inside the cathedral, just once, for a friend's wedding. The wedding was okay, but I remember coming in on my own to test the acoustics an hour or so before the rehearsal. Ever since then, I've been a little unsure about how Jilly views this kind of place. My fiddling didn't feel enclosed. Instead, the walls seemed to open the music right up. The cathedral gave the reel I was playing a stately grace, a spiritual grace, that it had never held for me before. I suppose it had more to do with the architect's design than the presence of God. Still, I could have played there all night, only... But I'm rambling again. I've filled a couple of pages now, which is more than I've done all week, except after just rereading what I've written so far, I don't know if any of it's relevant. Maybe I should just tell you about Paperjack. I don't know that it starts with him exactly, but it's probably as good a place as any to begin. It was a glorious day, made all the more precious because the weather had been so weird that spring. One day I'd be bundled up in a jacket and scarf, cloth cap on my head, with fingerless gloves to keep the cold from my finger joints while I was out busking. The next I'd be in a t-shirt, breaking into a sweat just thinking about standing out on some street corner to play tunes. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. The sun was halfway home from noon to the western horizon, and Jilly and I were just soaking up the rays on the steps of St. Paul's. I was slouched on the steps, leaning on one elbow, my fiddle case propped up beside me, wishing I'd worn shorts because my jeans felt like leaden weights on my legs. Sitting beside me, perched like a cat about to pounce on something terribly interesting that only it could see, Jilly was her usual scruffy self. There were flecks of paint on her loose cotton pants and her short-sleeved blouse, more under her fingernails and still more half lost in the tangles of her hair. She turned to look at me, her face miraculously untouched by her morning's work, and gave me one of her patented smiles. "Did you ever wonder where he's from?" Jilly asked. That was one of her favorite phrases. Did you ever wonder? It could take you from considering if and when fish slept, or why people look up when they're thinking, to more arcane questions about ghosts, little people living behind wallboards, and the like. And she loved guessing about people's origins. Sometimes when I was busking, she'd tag along and sit by the wall at my back, sketching the people who were listening to me play. Invariably, she'd come up behind me and whisper in my ear, usually when I was in the middle of a complicated tune that needed all my attention. Something along the lines of, "The guy in the polyester suit? 10 to 1 he rides a big chopper on the weekends, complete with a jean vest." So I was used to it. Today she wasn't picking out some nameless stranger from a crowd. Instead, her attention was on Paperjack, sitting on the steps far enough below us that he couldn't hear what we were saying. Paperjack had the darkest skin I'd ever seen on a man, an amazing ebony that seemed to swallow light. He was in his mid-60s, I'd guess, short corkscrew hair all gone gray. The dark suits he wore were threadbare and out of fashion, but always clean. Under his suit jacket he usually wore a white t-shirt that flashed so brightly in the sun it almost hurt your eyes, just like his teeth did when he gave you that lopsided grin of his. Nobody knew his real name, and he never talked. I don't know if he was mute, or if he just didn't have anything to say, but the only sounds I ever heard him make were a chuckle or a laugh. People started calling him Paperjack because he worked an origami gig on the streets. He was a master at folding paper into shapes. He kept a bag of different colored paper by his knee. People would pick their color and then tell him what they wanted, and he'd make it. No cuts, just folding. And he could make anything, from simple flower and animal shapes to things so complex it didn't seem possible for him to capture their essence in a piece of folded paper. So far as I know, he'd never disappointed a single customer. I'd seen some of the old men come down from Little Japan to sit and watch him work. They called him sensei, a term of respect that they didn't exactly bandy around. But origami was only the most visible side of his gig. He also told fortunes. He had one of those little folded paper Chinese fortune-telling devices that we all played around with when we were kids. You know the kind. You fold the corners into the center, turn it over, then fold them in again. When you're done, you can stick your index fingers and thumbs inside the little flaps of the folds and open it up so that it looks like a flower. You move your fingers back and forth, and it looks like the flower's talking to you. Paperjack's fortune teller was just like that. It had the names of 4 colors on the outside and 8 different numbers inside. First you picked a color, say red. The fortune teller would seem to talk soundlessly as his fingers moved back and forth to spell the word R-E-D, opening and closing until there'd be a choice from 4 of the numbers. Then you picked a number, and he counted it out until the fortune teller was open with another or the same set of numbers revealed. Under the number you choose at that point was your fortune. Paperjack didn't read it out. He just showed it to the person, then stowed the fortune teller back into the inside pocket of his jacket from which he'd taken it earlier. I'd never had my fortune read by him, but Jilly'd had it done for her a whole bunch of times. "The fortunes are always different," she told me once. "I sat behind him while he was doing one for a customer, and I read the fortune over her shoulder. When she'd paid him, I got mine done. I picked the same number she did, but when he opened it, there was a different fortune there." "He's just got more than one of those paper fortune tellers in his pocket," I said, but she shook her head. "He never put it away," she said. "It was the same fortune teller, the same number, but sometime between the woman's reading and mine, it changed." I knew there could be any number of logical explanations for how that could have happened, starting with plain sleight of hand. but I'd long ago given up continuing arguments with Jilly when it comes to that kind of thing. Was Paperjack magic? Not in my book. At least not the way Jilly thought he was. But there was a magic about him. The magic that always hangs like an aura about someone who's as good an artist as Paperjack was. He also made me feel good. Around him, an overcast day didn't seem half so gloomy, and when the sun shone, it always seemed brighter. He just exuded a glad feeling that you couldn't help but pick up on. So, in that sense, he was magic. I'd also wondered where he'd come from, how he'd ended up on the street. Street people seemed pretty well evenly divided between those who had no choice but to be there and those who chose to live there like I do. But even then there's a difference. I had a little apartment not far from Jilly's. I could get a job when I wanted one, usually in the winter when the busking was bad and club gigs were slow. Not many street people have that choice, but I thought that Paperjack might be one of them. "He's such an interesting guy," Jilly was saying. I nodded. "But I'm worried about him," she went on. "How so?" Jilly's brow wrinkled with a frown. "He seems to be getting thinner, and he doesn't get around as easily as he once did. You weren't here when he showed up today. He walked as though gravity had suddenly doubled its pull on him." "Well, he's an old guy, Jilly." "That's exactly it. Where does he live? Does he have someone to look out for him?" That was Jilly for you. She had a heart as big as the city, with room in it for everyone and everything. She was forever taking in strays, be they dogs, cats, or people. I'd been one of her strays once, but that was a long time ago. "Maybe we should ask him," I said. "He can't talk," she reminded me. "Maybe he just doesn't want to talk." Jilly shook her head. "I've tried a zillion times. He hears what I'm saying, and somehow he manages to answer with a smile or a raised eyebrow or whatever, but he doesn't talk." The wrinkles in her brow deepened until I wanted to reach over and smooth them out. "These days," she added, "he seems haunted to me." If someone else had said that, I'd know that they meant Paperjack had something troubling him. With Jilly, though, you often had to take that kind of a statement literally. "Are we talking ghosts now?" I asked. I tried to keep the skepticism out of my voice, but from the flash of disappointment that touched Jilly's eyes, I knew I hadn't done a very good job. "Oh, Geordie," she said, "why can't you just believe what happened to us?" Here's one version of what happened that night, some 3 years ago now, to which Jilly was referring. We saw a ghost. He stepped out of the past on a rainy night and stole away the woman I loved. At least that's the way I remember it. Except for Jilly, no one else does. Her name was Samantha Ray. She worked at Gypsy Records and had an apartment on Stanton Street. Except after that night, when the past came up to steal her away, no one at Gypsy Records remembered her anymore, and the landlady of her Stanton Street apartment had never heard of her. The ghost hadn't just stolen her. He'd stolen all memory of her existence. All I had left of her was an old photograph that Jilly and I found in Moore's Antiques a little while later. It had a photographer's date on the back, 1912. It was Sam in the picture. Sam with a group of strangers standing on the front porch of some old house. I remembered her, but she'd never existed. That's what I had to believe, because nothing else made sense. I had all these feelings and memories of her, but they had to be what my brother called jamais vu. That's like déjà vu, except instead of having felt you'd been somewhere before, you remembered something that had never happened. I'd never heard the expression before. He got it from a David Morrell thriller that he'd been reading, but it had an authentic ring about it. Jamais vu. But Jilly remembered Sam, too. Thinking about Sam always brought a tightness to my chest. It made my head hurt trying to figure it out. I felt as if I were betraying Sam by trying to convince myself she'd never existed. But I had to convince myself of that because believing that it really had happened was even scarier. How do you live in a world where anything can happen?
You'll get used to it, Jilly told me. There's a whole invisible world out there, lying side by side with our own. Once you get a peek into it, the window doesn't close. You're always going to be aware of it.
I don't want to be, I said. She just shook her head.
You don't really get a lot of choice in this kind of thing, she said.
You always have a choice. That's what I believe. And I chose to not get caught up in some invisible world of ghosts and spirits and who knew what. But I still dreamed of Sam, as if she'd been real. I still kept her photo in my fiddle case. I could feel its presence right now, glimmering through the leather, whispering to me. Remember me? I couldn't forget. Jamais vu. But I wanted to. Jilly scooted a little closer to me on the step and laid a hand on my knee.
Denying it just makes things worse, she said,
continuing an old ongoing argument that I don't think we'll ever resolve.
Until you accept that it really happened, the memory's always going to haunt you, undermining everything that makes you who you are.
Haunted like Paperjack? I asked, trying to turn the subject back onto some more comfortable ground, or at least focus the attention onto someone other than myself. Is that what you think's happened to him?
Jilly sighed. Memories can be just like ghosts, she said.
Didn't I know it? I looked down the steps to where Paperjack had been sitting, but he was gone, and now a couple of pigeons were waddling across the steps. The wind blew a candy bar wrapper up against a riser. I laid my hand on Jilly's and gave it a squeeze, then picked up my fiddle case and stood up. I've got to go, I told her.
I didn't mean to upset you.
I know. I've just got to walk for a bit and think. She didn't offer to accompany me, and for that I was glad. Jilly was my best friend, but right then I had to be alone. I went rambling. Just let my feet take me wherever they felt like going, south from St. Paul's and down Battersfield Road all the way to the pier, my fiddle case banging against my thigh as I walked. When I got to the waterfront, I leaned up against the fieldstone wall where the pier met the beach. I stood and watched the fishermen work their lines farther out over the lake. Fat gulls wheeled above, crying like they hadn't been fed in months. Down on the sand, a couple was having an animated discussion, but they were too far away for me to make out what they were arguing about. They looked like figures in some old silent movie, caricatures, their movements larger than life, rather than real people. I don't know what I was thinking about. I was trying not to think, I suppose, but I wasn't having much luck. The arguing couple depressed me. Hang on to what you've got, I wanted to tell them, but it wasn't any of my business. I thought about heading across town to Fitzhenry Park. There was a part of it called the Silenus Gardens, filled with stone benches and statuary where I always felt better, when I spied a familiar figure sitting down by the river west of the pier. Paperjack. The Kickahaw River was named after that branch of the Algonquin language family that originally lived in this area before the white men came and took it all away from them. All the tribe had left now was a reservation north of the city, and this river named after them. The Kickahaw had its source north of the reserve and cut through the city on its way to the lake. In this part of town it separated the business section and commercial waterfront from the beaches where the money lives. There are houses in the beaches that make the old stately homes in Lower Crowsea look like tenements, but you can't see them from here. Looking west, all you see is green. First the city commission's manicured lawns on either side of the river, then the treed hills that hide the homes of the wealthy from the rest of us plebes. On the waterfront itself are a couple of country clubs and the private beaches of the really wealthy, whose estates back right onto the water. Paperjack was sitting on this side of the river doing I don't know what. From where I stood, I couldn't tell. He seemed to be just sitting there on the riverbank, watching the slow water move past. I watched him for a while, then hoisted my fiddle case from where I'd leaned it against the wall and hopped down to the sand. When I got to where he was sitting, he looked up and gave me an easy, welcoming grin, as if he'd been expecting me to show up. Running into him like this was fate, Jilly would say. I'll stick to calling it coincidence. It's a big city, but it isn't that big. Paperjack made a motion with his hand, indicating I should pull up a bit of lawn beside him. I hesitated for a moment. Right up until then, I realized later, everything could have worked out differently. But I made the choice and sat beside him. There was a low wall right down by the water, with rushes and lilies growing up against it. Among the lilies was a family of ducks, mother and a paddling of ducklings, and that was what Paperjack had been watching. He had an empty plastic bag in his hand, and the breadcrumbs that remained in the bottom told me he'd been feeding the ducks until his bread ran out. He made another motion with his hand, touching the bag, then pointing to the ducks. I shook my head. I wasn't planning on coming down, I said, so I didn't bring anything to feed them. He nodded, understanding. We sat quietly a while longer. The ducks finally gave up on us and paddled farther up the river, looking for better pickings. Once they were gone, Paperjack turned to me again. He laid his hand against his heart, then raised his eyebrows questioningly. Looking at that slim black hand with its long, narrow fingers lying against his dark suit, I marveled again at the sheer depth of his ebony coloring. Even with the bit of a tan I'd picked up busking the last few weeks, I felt absolutely pallid beside him. Then I lifted my gaze to his eyes. If his skin swallowed light, I knew where it went. Into his eyes. They were dark, so dark you could barely tell the difference between pupil and cornea, but inside their darkness was a kind of glow, a shine that resonated inside me like the deep hum that comes from my fiddle's bass strings whenever I play one of those wild Shetland reels in A minor. I suppose it's odd, describing something visual in terms of sound, but right then, right at that moment, I heard the shine of his eyes, singing inside me, and I understood immediately what he'd meant by his gesture. Yeah, I said, I'm feeling a little low. He touched his chest again, but it was a different, lighter gesture this time. I knew what that meant as well. There's not much anybody can do about it, I said. Except Sam. She could come back. Or maybe if I just knew she'd been real. But that opened a whole other line of thinking that I wasn't sure I wanted to get into again. I wanted her to have been real. I wanted her to come back. But if I accepted that, I also had to accept that ghosts were real, and that the past could sneak up and steal someone from the present, taking them back into a time that had already been and gone. Paperjack took his fortune-telling device out of the breast pocket of his jacket and gave me a questioning look. I started to shake my head, but before I could think about what I was doing, I just said, "What the hell?" and let him do his stuff. I chose blue from the colors because that was the closest to how I was feeling. He didn't have any colors like confused or lost or foolish. I watched his fingers move the paper to spell out the color, then chose 4 from the numbers because that's how many strings my fiddle has. When his fingers stopped moving the second time, I picked 7, for no particular reason at all. He folded back the paper flap so I could read my fortune. All it said was, "Swallow the past." I didn't get it. I thought it'd say something like that Bobby McFerrin song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." What it did say didn't make any sense at all. "I don't understand," I told Paperjack. "What's it supposed to mean?" He just shrugged. Folding up the fortune teller, he put it back in his pocket. Swallow the past. Did that mean I was supposed to forget about it? Or, well, swallow could also mean believe or accept. Was that what he was trying to tell me? Was he echoing Jilly's argument? I thought about that photo in my fiddle case, and then an idea came to me. I don't know why I'd never thought of it before. I grabbed my fiddle case and stood up. I wanted to thank him, but somehow the words just escaped me. All that came out was, "I've got to run." But I could tell he understood my gratitude. I wasn't exactly sure what he'd done, except that that little message on his fortune teller had put together a connection for me that I'd never seen before. "Fate," I could hear Jilly saying. Paperjack smiled and waved me off. I followed coincidence away from Paperjack and the riverbank, and back up Battersfield Road to the Newford Public Library in Lower Crosey. Time does more than erode a riverbank or wear mountains down into tired hills. It takes the edge from our memories as well, overlaying everything with a soft focus so that it all blurs together. What really happened gets all jumbled up with the hopes and dreams we once had, and what we wish had really happened. Did you ever run into someone you went to school with? Someone you never really hung around with, but just passed in the halls, or had a class with, and they act like you were the best of buddies because that's how they remember it? For that matter, maybe you were buddies, and it's you that's remembering it wrong. Starting some solid detective work on what happened to Sam took the blur from my memories and brought her back into focus for me. The concepts of ghosts or people disappearing into the past just got pushed to one side, and all I thought about was Sam and tracking her down. If not the Sam I had known, then the woman she'd become in the past. My friend Amy Scallon works at the library. She's a tall, angular woman with russet hair and long fingers that would have stood her in good stead at a piano keyboard. Instead, she took up the uilleann pipes, and we play together in an on-again, off-again band called Johnny Jump Up. Matt Casey, our third member, is the reason we're not that regular a band. Matt's a brilliant bouzouki and guitar player and a fabulous singer, but he's not got much in the way of social skills, and he's way too cynical for my liking. Since he and I don't really get along well, it makes rehearsals kind of tense at times. On the other hand, I love playing with Amy. She's the kind of musician who has such a good time playing that you can't help but enjoy yourself as well. Whenever I think of Amy, the first image that always comes to mind is of her rangy frame folded around her pipes, right elbow moving back and forth on the bellows to fill the bag under her left arm, those long fingers just dancing on the chanter, foot tapping, head bobbing, a grin on her face. She always makes sure that the gig goes well, and we have a lot of fun, so it balances out, I guess. I showed her the picture I had of Sam. There was a street number on the porch's support pillar to the right of the steps, and enough of the house in the picture that I'd be able to match it up to the real thing, if I could find out what street it was on, if the house still existed. "This could take forever," Amy said as she laid the photo down on the desk. "I've got the time." Amy laughed. "I suppose you do. I don't know how you do it, Geordie. Everyone else in the world has to bust their buns to make a living, but you just cruise on through." "The trick's having a low overhead," I said. Amy just rolled her eyes. She'd been to my apartment, and there wasn't much to see. A spare fiddle hanging on the wall with a couple of Jilly's paintings, some tune books with tattered covers and some changes of clothing, one of those old-fashioned record players that had the turntable and speakers all in one unit, and a few albums leaning against the side of the apple crate it sat on, a couple of bows that desperately needed re-hairing, a handful of used paperbacks I'd picked up for the week's reading from Duffy's used books over on Walker Street, and a little beat-up old cassette machine with a handful of tapes. And that was it. I got by. I waited at the desk while Amy got the books we needed. She came back with an armload. Most had Newford in the title, but a few also covered that period of time when the city was still called Ewers, after the Dutchman Diederik van Ewers, who first settled the area in the early 1800s. It got changed to Newford back around the turn of the century, so all that's left now to remind the city of its original founding father is a street name. Setting the books down before me on the desk, Amy went off into the stacks to look for some more obscure titles. I didn't wait for her to get back, but went ahead and started flipping through the first book on the pile, looking carefully at the pictures. I started off having a good time. There's a certain magic in old photos, especially when they're of the place where you grew up. They cast a spell over you. Dirt roads where now there was pavement, sided by office complexes. The old Brewster Theater in its heyday. I remembered it as the place where I first saw Phil Ochs and Bob Dylan, and later all-night movie festivals. But the Williamson Street Mall stood there now. Boating parties on the river. Old City Hall. It was a youth hostel these days. But my enthusiasm waned with the afternoon. By the time the library closed, I was no closer to getting a street name for the house in Sam's photo than I had been when I came in. Amy gave me a sympathetic I-told-you-so look when we separated on the front steps of the library. I just told her I'd see her tomorrow. I had something to eat at Catherine's Cafe. I'd gone there hoping to see Jilly, only I'd forgotten it was her night off. I tried calling her when I'd finished eating, but she was out. So I took my fiddle over to the theater district and worked the crowds waiting in line there for an hour or so before I headed off for home, my pockets heavy with change. That night, just before I fell asleep, I felt like a hole sort of opened in the air above my bed. Lying there, I found myself touring Newford, just floating through its streets. Though the time was the present, there was no color. Everything appeared in the same sepia tones as in my photo of Sam. I don't remember when I finally did fall asleep. The next morning, I was at the library right when it opened, carrying 2 cups of take-out coffee in a paper bag, one of which I offered to Amy when I got to her desk. Amy muttered something like, "When owls prowl the day, they shouldn't look so bloody cheerful about it," but she accepted the coffee and cleared a corner of her desk so that I could get back to the books. In the photo I had of Sam, there was just the edge of a bay window visible beside the porch, with a fairly unique, rounded gingerbread trim running off from either side of its keystone. I'd thought it would be the clue to tracking down the place. It looked almost familiar, but I was no longer sure if that was because I'd actually seen the house at some time, or it was just from looking at the photo so much. Unfortunately, those details weren't helping at all. "You know, there's no guarantee you're going to find a picture of the house you're looking for in those books," Amy said around mid-morning when she was taking her coffee break. They didn't exactly go around taking pictures of everything. I was at the last page of Walks Through Old Croce. Closing the book, I set it on the finished pile beside my chair and then leaned back, lacing my fingers behind my head. My shoulders were stiff from sitting hunched over a desk all morning. "I know. I'm going to give Jack a call when I'm done here to see if I can borrow his bike this afternoon." "You're going to pedal all around town looking for this house?" "What else can I do? There's always the archives at the main library." I nodded, feeling depressed. It had seemed like such a good idea yesterday. It was still a good idea. I just hadn't realized how long it would take. "Or you could go someplace like the market and show the photo around to some of the older folks. Maybe one of them will remember the place." "I suppose." I picked up the next book, The Architectural Heritage of Old Ewers, and went back to work. And there it was, on page 38, the house. There were 3 buildings in a row in the photo. The one I'd been looking for was the middle one. I checked the caption. Grasso Street, circa 1920. "I don't believe it," Amy said. I must have made some kind of a noise because she was looking up at me from her own work. "You found it, didn't you?" she added. "I think so. Have you got a magnifying glass?" She passed it over and I checked out the street number of the middle house. 142. The same as in my photo. Amy took over then. She phoned a friend who worked in the land registry office. He called back a half-hour later and gave us the name of the owner in 1912 when my photo had been taken. Edward Dickinson. The house had changed hands a number of times since the Dickinsons had sold it in the 40s. We checked the phone book, but there were over 100 Dickinsons listed, 12 with just an initial E and one Ed. None of the addresses were on Grasso Street. "Which makes sense," Amy said, "since they sold the place 50 years ago." I wanted to run by that block on Grasso where the house was. I'd passed it I don't know how many times and never paid much attention to it or any of its neighbors. But I needed more background on the Dickinsons first. Amy showed me how to run the microfiche, and soon I was going through back issues of the Newford Star and the Daily Journal, concentrating on the local news sections and the gossip columns. The first photo of Edward Dickinson that came up was in the Daily Journal, the June 21st, 1913 issue. He was standing with the Dean of Butler University at some opening ceremony. I compared him to the people with Sam in my photo and found him standing behind her to her left. Now that I was on the right track, I began to work in a kind of frenzy. I whipped through the microfiche, making notes of every mention of the Dickinsons. Edward turned out to have been a stockbroker, one of the few who didn't lose his shirt in subsequent market crashes. Back then the money lived in Lower Crosey, mostly on McKennet, Grasso, and Stanton streets. Edward made the papers about once a month. Business deals, society galas, fundraising events, political dinners, and the like. It wasn't until I hit the October 29, 1915 issue of the Newford Star that I had the wind knocked out of my sails. It was the picture that got to me. Sam, and a man who was no stranger. I'd seen him before. He was the ghost that had stepped out of the past and stolen her away. Under the photo was a caption announcing the engagement of Thomas Edward Dickinson, son of the well-known local businessman, to Samantha Ray. In the picture of Sam that I had, Dickinson wasn't there with the rest of the people. He'd probably taken it. But here he was, real, with Sam. I couldn't ignore it. Back then they didn't have the technology to make a photograph lie. There was a weird buzzing in my ears as that picture burned its imprint onto my retinas. It was hard to breathe, and my t-shirt suddenly seemed too tight. I don't know what I'd been expecting, but I knew it wasn't this. I suppose I thought I'd track down the people in the picture and find out that the woman who looked like Sam was actually named Gertrude something or other, and she'd lived her whole life with that family. I didn't expect to find Sam. I didn't expect the ghost to have been real. I was in a daze as I put away the microfiche and shut down the machine. "Geordie?" Amy asked as I walked by her desk. "Are you okay?" I remember nodding and muttering something about needing a break. I picked up my fiddle and headed for the front door. The next thing I remember is standing in front of the address on Grasso Street and looking at the Dickinsons' house. I had no idea who owned it now. I hadn't been paying much attention to Amy after she told me that the Dickinsons had sold it. Someone had renovated it fairly recently, so it didn't look at all the same as in the photos, but under its trendy additions I could see the lines of the old house. I sat down on the curb with my fiddle case across my knees and just stared at the building. The buzzing was back in my head. My shirt still felt too tight. I didn't know what to do anymore, so I just sat there, trying to make sense out of what couldn't be reasoned away. I no longer had any doubt that Sam had been real, or that a ghost had stolen her away. The feeling of loss came back all over again, as if it had happened just now, not 3 years ago. And what scared me was, if she and the ghost were real, then what else might be? I closed my eyes and headlines of supermarket tabloids flashed across my eyes, a strobing flicker of bizarre images and words. That was the world Jilly lived in, one in which anything was possible. I didn't know if I could handle living in that kind of world. I needed rules and boundaries, patterns. It was a long time before I got up and headed for Catherine's cafe. The first thing Jilly asked when I got in the door was, "Have you seen Paperjack?" It took me a few moments to push back the clamor of my own thoughts to register what she'd asked. Finally, I just shook my head.
"He wasn't at St. Paul's today," Jilly went on, "and he's always there, rain or shine, winter or summer. I didn't think he was looking well yesterday, and now—"
I tuned her out and took a seat at an empty table before I could fall down. That feeling of dislocation that had started up in me when I first saw Sam's photo in the microfiche kept coming and going in waves. It was cresting right now, and I found it hard to just sit in the chair, let alone listen to what Jilly was saying. I tuned her back in when the spaciness finally started to recede.
"Heart attack? Who would he call? He can't speak."
"I saw him yesterday," I said, surprised that my voice sounded so calm. "Around mid-afternoon. He seemed fine."
"He did?"
I nodded. "He was down by the pier, sitting on the riverbank feeding the ducks. He read my fortune."
"He did?"
"You're beginning to sound like a broken record, Jilly." For some reason I was starting to feel better. That sense of being on the verge of a panic attack faded and then disappeared completely. Jilly pulled up a chair and leaned across the table, elbows propped up, chin cupped in her hands.
"So tell me," she said, "what made you do it? What was your fortune?"
I told her everything that had happened since I had seen Paperjack. That sense of dislocation came and went again a few times while I talked, but mostly I was holding firm.
"Holy shit!"
Jilly said when I was done. She put her hand to her mouth and looked quickly around, but none of the customers seemed to have noticed. She reached a hand across the table and caught one of mine.
"So now you believe?"
she asked. "I don't have a whole lot of choice, do I?"
"What are you going to do?"
I shrugged. "What's to do? I found out what I needed to know. Now I've got to learn to live with it and all the other baggage that comes with it." Jilly didn't say anything for a long moment. She just held my hand and exuded comfort, as only Jilly can.
"You could find her," she said finally.
"Who, Sam?"
"Who else?"
"She's probably—" I stumbled over the word dead and settled for not even alive anymore.
"Maybe not," Jilly said. "She'd definitely be old. But don't you think you should find out?"
I wasn't sure I wanted to know. And if she were alive, I wasn't sure I wanted to meet her. What could we say to each other?
"Think about it anyway," Jilly said.
That was Jilly. She never took no for an answer.
"I'm off at 8, she said. "Do you want to meet me then?"
"What's up?" I asked, half-heartedly.
"I thought maybe you'd help me find Paperjack."
I might as well, I thought. I was becoming a bit of an expert in tracking people down by this point. Maybe I should get a card printed. Geordie Riddle, Private Investigations and Fiddle Tunes. "Sure," I told her.
"Great," Jilly said.
She bounced up from her seat as a couple of new customers came into the cafe. I ordered a coffee from her after she'd gotten them seated, then stared out the window at the traffic going by on Battersfield. I tried not to think of Sam, trapped in the past, making a new life for herself there, but I might as well have tried to jump to the moon. By the time Jilly came off shift, I was feeling almost myself again, but instead of being relieved, I had this great load of guilt hanging over me. It all centered around Sam and the ghost. I'd denied her once. Now I felt as though I was betraying her all over again. Knowing what I knew, the photo accompanying the engagement notice in that old issue of the Newford Star flashed across my mind. The way I was feeling at the moment didn't seem right. I felt too normal, and so the guilt. "I don't get it," I said to Jilly as we walked down Battersfield towards the pier. This afternoon I was falling to pieces, but now I just feel
calm?
Yeah.
That's because you finally stopped fighting yourself and accepted that what you saw, what you remember, really happened. It was denial that was screwing you up.
She didn't add, "I told you so," but she didn't have to. It echoed in my head anyway, joining the rest of the guilt I was carrying around with me. If I'd only listened to her with an open mind, then what? I wouldn't be going through this all over again? We crossed Lakeside Drive and made our way through the closed concession and souvenir stands to the beach. When we reached the pier, I led her westward to where I'd last seen Paperjack, but he wasn't sitting by the river anymore. A lone duck regarded us hopefully, but neither of us had thought to bring any bread. "So I tracked down Sam," I said, still more caught up in my personal quest than in looking for Paperjack. "If she's not dead, she'll be an old lady. If I find her, then what?"
"You'll complete the circle," Jilly said. She looked away from the river and faced me, her pixie features serious. "It's like the Kikaha say, everything is on a wheel. You stepped off the one that represents your relationship with Sam before it came full circle. Until you complete your turn on it, you'll never have peace of mind."
"When do you know you've come full circle?" I asked.
"You'll know."
She turned away before I could go on and started back towards the pier. By day, the place was crowded and full of noise, alive with tourists and people out relaxing, just looking to have a good time. By night, its occupancy was turned over to gangs of kids, fooling around on skateboards or simply hanging out, and the homeless, winos, bag ladies, hobos, and the like. Jilly worked the crowd asking after Paperjack while I followed in her wake. Everybody knew him, or had seen him in the past week, but no one knew where he was now, or where he lived. We were about to give up and head over to Fitzhenry Park to start over again with the people hanging out there, when we heard the sound of a harmonica. It was playing the blues, a soft, mournful sound that drifted up from the beach. We made for the nearest stairs and then walked back across the sand to find the boss man sitting under the boardwalk, hands cupped around his instrument, head bowed down, eyes closed. There was no one listening to him except us. The people with money to throw in his old cloth cap were having dinner now in the fancy restaurants across Lakeside Drive, or over in the theater district. He was just playing for himself. When he was busking, he stuck to popular pieces, whatever was playing on the radio mixed with old show tunes, jazz favorites, and that kind of thing. The music that came from his harmonica now was pure magic. It transformed him, making him larger than life. The blues he played held all the world's sorrows in its long, sliding notes, and didn't so much change it as make it bearable. My fingers itched to pull out my fiddle and join him, but we hadn't come to jam, so we waited until he was done. The last note hung in the air for far longer than seemed possible. Then he brought his hands away from his mouth and cradled the harmonica on his lap. He looked up at us from under drooping eyelids, the magic disappearing now that he'd stopped playing. He was just an old, homeless black man now, with the faint trace of a smile touching his lips.
"Hey, Jill, Geordie," he said. "What's doing?"
"We're looking for Paperjack,"
Jilly told him. The boss man nodded.
"Jack's a man for paperwork, all right."
"I've been worried about him," Jilly said. "About his health."
"You a doctor now, Jill?"
She shook her head.
"Anybody got a smoke?"
This time we both shook our heads. From his pocket he pulled out a half-smoked butt that he must have picked up off the boardwalk earlier, then lit it with a wooden match that he struck on the zipper of his jeans. He took a long drag and let it out so that the blue-gray smoke wreathed his head, studying us all the while.
"You care too much. You just get hurt,"
he said finally.
Jilly nodded. I know, but I can't help it. Do you know where we can find him?
Well now, come winter, he lives with a Mex family down in the barrio.
And in the summer?
The boss man shrugged.
I heard once he's got himself a camp up behind the beaches.
Thanks,
Jilly said.
He might not take to uninvited guests,
the boss man added.
Body gets himself an out-of-the-way squat like that, I think he'd be looking for privacy.
I don't want to intrude, Jilly assured him. I just want to make sure he's okay.
The boss man nodded.
You're a stand-up kind of lady, Jill. I trust you to do what's right. I've been thinking old Jack's looking a little peaked myself. It's something in his eyes. Like just making do is getting to be a chore. But you take care going back up in there.